Hello biology students, and welcome to this video, which is going to be all about the biological levels of organization. So it turns out living things are pretty complicated, and if we don't have ways to organize both things inside living things and groups of living things, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around how living things work. So therefore, humans have devised different levels with which we can classify living things, basically to make it easier for us to understand how they work. So in this video, we're going to be walking through each of these levels and what they mean. So the smallest level of organization that exists in living things, and actually this level happens to exist in non-living things as well, are subatomic particles. So these are basically the smallest level that we could study something living at. And these are the particles that make up atoms. So you've heard of these in previous science classes. So they include protons, neutrons, and electrons. So if we wanted to study something living at a really microscopic level, we could study its subatomic particles. So I'm sure you remember from previous science classes that subatomic particles organize themselves in a very specific way. So in a given atom, the protons and neutrons are found in the area called the nucleus, and then the electrons are found circling the nucleus. And if this seems a little hazy to you, we'll come back to this a little bit later in the unit as well. So the next largest unit is the atom. So the subatomic particle was smaller than an atom, and that name makes sense. Sub usually means smaller than. So subatomic particle means a particle smaller than an atom. So if you take your protons, neutrons, and electrons and combine them together, you get one atom, which is what is pictured here. And you can think of atoms as the basic building blocks of matter. So all things, living and non-living, are made up of atoms. You could have carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, iron atoms, basically any of those elements you hear about on the periodic table. If you had one teeny tiny piece of one of those elements, that would be an atom. So now, if you take atoms and combine them together, then you get a molecule. So if I have more than one type of atoms bonded together, that's a molecule. So if I took an oxygen atom and bound it to two hydrogen atoms, that would be a molecule of water. I can also take two oxygen atoms and bind those together, and that would be an oxygen molecule. So whenever you have two or more atoms bonded together, that's a molecule. Now, these can be things that are pretty small, like oxygen or water, or it can be something huge, like DNA, which is pictured here, is actually millions and millions and millions of atoms bonded together. So now, if we take many, many molecules and combine them together, we get, in living things, what's called an organelle. Now, organelles are found in living things, but organelles themselves are not living. So if I was holding one organelle in my hand, that would not be a living thing. Just like if I was holding one molecule or one atom in my hand, that wouldn't be a living thing. So we officially define an organelle as a membrane-bound structure, which means a structure that's surrounded in a membrane that performs a certain job in the cell. Now, in a cell, if we didn't have organelles, it wouldn't be clear what part of the cell does what job. So you can think organelles are these little separate compartments in a cell that perform specific functions for that cell. So you've heard of some organelles. I'm sure you've heard of the nucleus. That's the organelle in the center of the cell right here, where DNA is held. You might have heard of the mitochondria, right? This provides all the energy for the cell. And then chloroplasts are an organelle that are unique to plants that help take sunlight, light energy, and convert it into sugar. So there are many more organelles. In fact, we're going to do a whole unit on the organelles, so we will see more about organelles later. Now, if I took a bunch of organelles and combined them together in just the right way, that would now give me a living cell. And something super important I want to point out, this is the smallest unit that's actually considered living. So if I was holding one atom, or if I were holding one molecule, or holding one organelle, that would not be a living thing. But if I were holding one cell, that is considered the basic unit of life. Now I have a living thing in my hand. And there are tons of different types of cells. Just in your body, you have skin cells, you have red blood cells, you have nerve cells, you have muscle cells. You have lots of different kinds of cells. And cells that are found in your body are not the only kind of cells as well. There are different cells that are found in plants as well that are not found in animals. So a couple things I want to point out about cells is all cells look very different. I think of the traditional cell we think of as, kind of a boring circular shape. But you can see this right here, this drawing here, this is a nerve cell. This is one cell, and it looks very different than that basic little circular shape that we're used to thinking as a cell. So we're going to see later on in the unit that cellular shape is very diverse. Okay, so now if I took a bunch of cells and put them together, the next biggest level of organization that I have would be a tissue. And you can think of this as grouping a bunch of cells that have a similar function together. So if, all the cells in one area of the body were working toward the same common goal, they would be considered a tissue. Now, there are 4 types of tissues that are found in animals. There's muscle tissue, connective tissue, which is things like bone, blood, like fascia, like all the stuff that connects things in your body. Muscle's pretty straightforward. Nervous tissue are things like your nerves, your spinal cord, your brain. And then finally, epidermal tissue, you can kind of think of this as skin. So it's basically the tissue that lines the outside of your body, and it also lines all of your organs. So like the skin inside your mouth, down your esophagus, and inside your stomach, but also like your actual skin, that's epidermal tissue. Now, plants have different kind of tissues that have funny names like sclerenchyma and parenchyma. We're not going to worry too much about those, but just know that these aren't the only 4 tissues on the planet. They're the 4 types that are found in animals. So now, if I took a bunch of tissues that were working on a similar function and put them together, that would give me an organ. So an organ we define as several tissues working together for a specific function. So I think a simple example that we've all heard of is the heart is an organ. So this I believe is a sheep's heart. Now, this heart has lots of different types of tissue in it. It has the muscle tissue, which you can kind of see here. That tissue actually allows the heart to beat and contract. But it also has epidermal tissue, tissue that lines the inside of the chambers of the heart. It also has connective tissue, like this fat you can see on the outside of the heart. The fat is a type of connective tissue. So you can see it's several different types of tissues working together. That's an organ. So now some other organs that you know of, things like the lungs, things like the brain, but also if we were thinking of a plant, the leaves would be an organ. So keep in mind that when we talk about organs, we're not just talking about things found in animals. Things found as plants count as organs as well. Okay. So now if I took several organs that were working together for a common goal and put them together, that would now be an organ system. So if we stay on our example from the heart combined with all the arteries and veins and capillaries, if you put all those organs together, they are all working towards the common goal of moving blood around the body. So that is called the cardiovascular organ system. Similarly, if I took the stomach and the esophagus and the small intestine and the large intestine and the liver, all of those organs work together towards breaking down and absorbing the nutrients from our food. So that would be considered the digestive system. Now, a plant example, I could take together the leaves and the petals and the reproductive parts of the plant, which are called the stamen and the stigma, and put those together, that all of those parts of the plant are really moving toward the purpose of allowing the plant to reproduce. So a flower would be considered an organ system in a plant because it's many organs working together towards a common function. So finally, now if I take my organ system and take many organisms that are working together, that finally gives me an organism. So this is an individual living thing. Now, something that's a little confusing is that there are living things that were way back at the singular cellular level. So if I had a bacteria, this is a drawing of a bacterial cell, clearly. This little bacteria would be alive, even though he's only made of one cell. He doesn't have tissues, organs, organ systems, and that's okay. But more complex, multicellular organisms, most of them have tissues, organs, and organ systems. So when we combine all those organ systems together, again, now that's called an organism. The bacteria is also considered an organism as well. It just does not have all those individual steps in between. So my point is that sometimes you can skip straight from cell to organism, and that's okay. So we know what living things are, things like humans, things like cheetahs, things like tree, fungi, bacterial cells, all of these things, mushrooms, they are all considered to be organisms. So now, every level above this, bigger than this now, are all going to be ecological levels. So we're talking about multiple organisms living together. So the first ecological level would be a population. So if I had a bunch of organisms of the same species all living together in a given area, that would be a population. So, these bison, they're all the same organisms. If I took all the bison that were living in some defined area that I defined, that would be a population of bison. You can think of all the people who live in Westwood are a population of humans, but also all the people who live in Massachusetts are a separate population of humans. So it matters what your given defined area is. Now, if I take all the populations in a defined area, that's now known as a community. So if I have all the bison in an area, but also all the hawks, and all the rattlesnakes, and all the prairie dogs, but also all the grass, and all the bacteria that are living in the soil, and all the mushrooms that are growing in this field, that would all be a community. All the living things, all the populations living in a defined area. The next biggest level is called an ecosystem, and this is when I add in the non-living things. So living and non-living things in a defined area. So here I have my bison and my hawks and my rattlesnakes and my prairie dogs and my mushrooms and my bacteria, my grass and my trees, but also I'm going to add in the weather, and I'm going to add in the air, and I'm going to add in the water and the mountains and the snow. So that makes up an ecosystem. And then the next largest level is called a biome. And this is basically if you looked across the planet and combined all the ecosystems that had a similar climate. So maybe, the climate in northern Africa is really similar to the climate in the western United States. So therefore, they are part of the same biome. They are both part of the desert biome. So you've heard of some of these as well. You've heard of rainforest. I'm sure you've heard of desert. You might have heard of tundra. We happen to live in a deciduous forest, which basically means that we have lots of trees that have broad leaves. But there are, several biomes that I'm sure you've studied in middle school science. And then finally, the last and biggest level, which I think is kind of silly, the biosphere. And basically, this is everywhere on Earth that exists is considered to be the biosphere. So this includes all the living things on land, underground, in the water, in the air, like our entire planet, including our atmosphere and including deep into our soil, is the biosphere. So there you have it. There are the levels of organization, and I'll see you in the next video.